Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. I'm going to turn it over to our interpreters for instructions.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Maria, and I'm here with Vicente. We are the interpreters with Tilde, and we're going to be interpreting for today's meeting. We have simultaneous interpretation because this is a bilingual space, so people may be speaking Spanish and English. If you are on a computer, please find an icon that looks like a globe at the bottom of your screen where it says interpretation. Please press that globe and then choose English. If you are not fully bilingual in Spanish and English, we invite you to follow these steps, because if someone speaks in Spanish, you're not going to understand. But if you choose to use the interpretation channel, you will hear the interpreter telling you what the person is saying. If you are on a cell phone or tablet, you're not going to find the globe at the bottom of your screen. So find the three little dots at the bottom right corner of your cell phones or tablets where it says more, and then you will see a menu. You can go up and down that menu with your finger until you find the option language interpretation, and then choose English and make sure to hit done to save your preferences. If you're going to be presenting tonight, please speak slowly and clearly for the interpretation. If you're not speaking, make sure you're muted. I'm gonna repeat these exact same instructions, but in Spanish now. Buenas tardes, mi nombre es María Sigorni y voy a ser una de las intérpretes junto con Vicente. Somos intérpretes de Tilde y este es un espacio bilingüe, entonces van a hablarse de los dos idiomas. Para accesar la interpretación, por favor, si están en una computadora, busquen un globo en la parte de abajo de sus pantallas donde dice Interpretation, presionen ese globo y escojan español. Si están en una tableta o en un celular, no van a encontrar ese globo, sino que busquen los 3 puntos en la esquina inferior derecha de su pantalla donde dice More o más, y se va a desplegar un menú. Pueden subir o bajar en ese menú con sus dedos hasta que encuentren la opción Language Interpretation o interpretación de idiomas, y luego presionen donde dice finalizado o done para que se guarden sus preferencias. Si van a estar presentando el día de hoy o hablando, por favor hablar despacio y claro para la interpretación. Si no están hablando, por favor asegurarse de que estén en silencio con el micrófono en rojo. Muchas gracias. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. This is Heidi Notario. I'm the Vice President of Strategic Partnerships and Systems Change with the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence. And I'm very happy to welcome you all today to this presentation and discussion centering Black, Indigenous, people of color survivors, advocacy and community responses, real talk, practical strategies. As part of our work to center BIPOC survivors and their families, this presentation supports this commitment at NRCDV, and you're going to hear from an extraordinary lineup of presenters, researchers, talk about not only the findings of a study, but also practical application of these findings within organizations to support advocates and survivors of color in their work. Today, I'm joined by Jill Davis from Greater Hartford Legal Aid, who will moderate the conversation today, a long-term friend of NRCDV, Lisa Goodman from Boston College, Kelly Coyne from Safe Horizon, and Lisa O'Connor, also from Safe Horizon. I'm going to now spend a few seconds talking to you about our accessibility features for our webinar, which is in alignment too with our commitment to accessibility and to the creation of multilingual spaces. So in an effort to create and support multilingual and accessible spaces, we have limited use of the chat function. It is difficult to translate it in real time and can be inaccessible to assistive devices. Please send your questions, comments, or resources directly to the event hosts and co-hosts who can read out responses with the support of the interpreting team. Thank you. So without any more delays, I'm going to turn it over to Jill Davis, who will moderate this discussion. Welcome, Jill.
Thank you, Heidi. And thanks also to NRC for all of their leadership and support for these really important discussions. Hello to everyone who's joined us. I want to welcome you to what I know is going to be an incredible opportunity to learn and think about our advocacy with BIPOC survivors. Too often, the options available to survivors and the ones that we advocates regularly use, our go-to strategies, are not what survivors of violence want or may even need. This can be particularly true for BIPOC survivors who, in addition to the violence, experience the harm of systemic racism and sexism, including living in poverty at disproportionately higher rates. Today, our truly survivor-centered presenters will explore what BIPOC survivors say will help, and also how to improve our advocacy and increase options for BIPOC and all survivors to be safer. We'll start by hearing from Dr. Lisa Goodman, who will talk about research focusing on the safety strategies BIPOC survivors use when they're in danger. Research provides us important information and helps us identify gaps in our understanding and practice. But we also know there are essential lessons to learn from our day-to-day advocacy with survivors and how we develop and run the organizations that advocates work in. To bring us those lessons, we're fortunate to have Kelly Coyne and Dr. Lisa O'Connor join us. These are two highly effective leaders who've played key roles in building and continuing to strengthen client-centered and anti-racism advocacy practices at Safe Horizon in New York City. I can tell you just from the discussions we've had in preparing for this webinar that all of these discussions across research and advocacy practice and organizational development were incredibly meaningful and inspiring. So I'll turn it over now to Lisa Goodman.
Great. Thank you so much, Jill and Heidi, and thank you to the interpreters and all of you who are working on the back end. Just really glad to be with you today, and I'm excited for to hear from Lisa and Kelly, my longtime research partners. Next slide, please. Slide after that, please. There we go. I just want to start by acknowledging the people who have contributed to what I have to say today. First are my co-authors listed here. I won't read their names out loud, but they've all been sort of amazing collaborators. This was a real labor of love. And then also to the advisory board, consisting of scholars and policymakers and survivors, some of whom are on this panel. And I'll say more about them in a little while too. And of course, to the women I'm going to talk about now who shared some very difficult stories. I'm going to be talking for about 30 minutes or a little less, I hope. Okay, so next slide, please. So the prompt for this project were in the wake of the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and so many others in 2020, this sort of expanded ongoing national conversation about the harms that arise at the intersection of race and policing, and the need for more community-based solutions. Within the domestic violence field, these conversations have ignited, as many of you know, fierce self-reflection, especially about the movement's entanglement with the criminal legal systems. So few programs in 2020 did not, for example, suggest hanging up and calling 911 in case of emergency. That's the way we did things. And in many cases still do, in most cases still do. So one example of what emerged from this ongoing conversation can be seen in a document called The Moment of Truth, Statement of Commitment to Black Lives. This was a document signed by 46 domestic violence and sexual assault coalitions, calling us to account for the ways that our reliance on police and prosecutors and prisons as primary solutions to intimate partner violence have failed survivors, and particularly survivors of color. And I'm just checking, not yet, but some of these, this document, for example, and several others that I'm going to talk about will be in the chat soon, so you can see for yourself. So this document, which really called for a shift away from the criminal legal system and towards community solutions like restorative justice and transformative justice, got us thinking about what was needed to really do this. And one of the things our research group realized we lacked were systematic data from survivors themselves, especially regarding moments of significant danger when they chose not to call the police. What were they doing in those moments? And how could we build on the wisdom of survivors themselves in developing alternatives? So that was the basis of this study. Next slide, please. More specifically, our study questions were, first of all, who do survivors already reach out to in moments of danger, separate and apart from whether they call the police? And then second, what factors across individual, interpersonal, and contextual levels influence survivors' goals and decisions in these moments? Next slide, please. So 3 ideas framed our approach to this study. One, we wanted to elicit the perspectives of survivors themselves to highlight their experience, their recommendations, and in particular to ensure a strong representation of BIPOC survivors given their centrality in discussions of alternatives to the police. And to do this, we partnered with community programs across the country. I'll tell you where in a few minutes. Then second, we wanted the insight of a range of stakeholders as we developed the study. We did this in 2 ways. First, we conducted a focus group with a very large group of advocates of color at one of our partnering programs, which is Safe Horizon, where our next 2 speakers come from. And this large group of advocates really helped us frame the right questions to ask. You'll hear what they are in a few minutes. We also formed this advisory group, and as I mentioned earlier, and sought their input periodically, especially in the interpretation of our findings stage. And then finally, we took a relational and ecological approach, seeking to understand in depth not just what participants did, but why and what influenced them. And we're particularly interested in their perceptions of themselves, their relationships, and their social contexts. Next slide, please. So we worked with a bunch of different community partners from Indiana, North Carolina, Kentucky, New York, and Massachusetts. To recruit participants, we asked advocates in programs in these states to send out flyers to survivors, and then survivors reached out to us by email or phone. In all, we interviewed 25 survivors, and I'll just let you take a look at their demographic characteristics. I'll just briefly state that most, though by no means all, identified as Black or African American. All were English speaking, all but one were US born, half were employed, mean age was 36 with a wide age range. Almost all of them had children, and 20 had spent time in shelters, 5 had not. And I can just tell you now that we didn't see any real differences between those 2 groups. We paid everyone $50 for their time, and we conducted our interviews on Zoom. So next slide, please, for the questions. So basically, after getting to know each other a little bit in these interviews, the interviewer asked the first big question. And this came out of the focus group that I mentioned that really helped us form this question, which was, I'm going to ask you to think about times when you or your children were deeply scared and unsafe because of your partner, when the situation went beyond your own capacity to deal with it on your own, and it felt like a real emergency. Can you tell me, and we would ask them, can you tell me about the first time it felt like that? And then the scariest time, the most recent time. So we got at least 3 distinct events and experiences. Often we got many more. And then we followed up with, who did you reach out to and why, and what happened, and is this what you wanted? Next slide, please. So in their responses to this opening question, it became clear that how participants thought about what constituted a real emergency. And it was generally a moment of dangerous change in their partner's behavior, like when the violence became much more severe, when the partner really lost control, or when the participant felt suddenly and completely powerless because of the partner's actions. Those were some of the themes and how they describe these dangerous moments. Next slide, please. So who did they reach out to in those moments? A full half of them reached out to no one, either most or all of the time. And I'm going to come back to this really central finding in a second. This finding really brings to light something that has been obscured in prior research, because most research on survivors' use of informal network members reveals, as many of you know, that most survivors rely very heavily on their informal networks, both before and during and after they reach out to formal systems. But our study was consistent with that, in that most participants did reach out to their informal networks at least once. But prior studies have focused on like survivors' general help seeking rather than systematically asking about specific incidents. So we took this more systematic approach of asking about specific and concrete individual violent encounters across time. And that approach provided this new insight that even for those survivors who had reached out over the course of their relationship, they also experienced plenty of dire emergency moments when they did not feel able to contact anyone from their informal network, friends, family, neighbors, community members, not anyone. And to me, this is a really sobering finding. Still, as I said, most did reach out to someone at least some of the time, mainly, as I said, to family members, friends, and neighbors. And their choices were based on the following criteria. Number one, by far the most important thing they were looking for is a person who would not judge, which is a striking finding given that one might expect a preference for a more kind of action-oriented response in a dangerous moment, but that was very much not the case. And then they also looked for people who could provide practical assistance, like a place to stay or a car to come get them. And third, somebody who lived close by. Next slide, please. So what did they receive when they did reach out? Many network responses that survivors described were painful ones, like discrediting the survivor, ranging from doubting them to full out not believing them, refusing to provide help, telling the survivor what to do, or conditioning assistance on their leaving the relationship. Fed up with you, you leave, and then I'm here for you kind of reactions. Some provided very useful practical help, like a place to stay, transportation out of the violent situation, coming to the scene to serve as a supportive presence, or very occasionally calling the police. And a very few provided the very few kind of help that participants had named as the number one thing they sought, which is empathic and non-judgmental listening. This was very much the minority of responses. So I want to turn now to, next slide, please, what influenced survivors' decision-making. Why is it that most participants felt they had no one to call most of the time, and when they did reach out, why the responses felt so bad? Fascinatingly, when we asked about influences, a lot of survivors immediately harkened back to early in life. So when we asked the question, so if you didn't call someone, why not? Many talked about different kinds of family rupture, and they talked about this in a variety of ways. And this is like the first set of influences, which we're calling interpersonal influences. So they talked about intergenerational trauma. Most of them talked about intergenerational trauma. Participants noted that Their mothers, their grandmothers, their siblings, their friends had themselves suffered violent victimization, including child abuse, neglect, partner violence, sexual assault, mostly within their families. And that in some families, participants felt that this had resulted in a kind of a desensitized perspective, like these things just happen. So one person said, my grandma, she stayed with a man that was abusing her. My dad, he stayed with a woman that was abusing him. My sister is still married to a guy that was abusing her. And it's like, it's a family pattern. It was always, you got to work it out. You got to stick with it. They never tell you how to leave. So I kept quiet for a long time. And then for others, this intergenerational trauma rendered their support networks too, in their view, too emotionally overwhelmed to really be able to listen in a meaningful way. Like one person described this as a constant triggering. She said, I wouldn't call my mother because it would just trigger her and she wouldn't be able to help me. She needs to heal before I can heal. So she just talked about many people in her family being constantly triggered by each other and by other things as well. Then a second category of interpersonal influences were systemic intrusions. And by that, I mean, there were many stories about systems, mainly child protective services, but some others as well, splitting up families early on in a way that they never recovered from. So they didn't really have anyone now in terms of family to support them. And then less frequently, but sometimes survivors talked about family disruption and instability due to addiction or incarceration or homelessness, or occasionally they just mentioned physical distance. There were several exceptions I want to make sure to highlight where survivors talked about incredible family strength and how family members would be there for them no matter what the risk even. But those were the exceptions, not the rule. So next slide, please. So in addition to interpersonal influences, there were explicit network messages that shaped their decision-making. So a lot of survivors talked about, even if there was someone in their life, sometimes they didn't feel like they could reach out to that person because of various messages they received from their networks, like domestic violence is a necessary evil, the network kind of lacking understanding of domestic violence dynamics, blaming them for inciting the violence themselves or provoking it, as I mentioned, disbelieving them, or just being disapproving or fed up with their own decision-making. Again, there were a few exceptions, mainly like best friends from earlier in life, who really seemed to get them and made them feel loved. Next slide, please. Another set of influences had to do with survivors' own orientations to relationships, which I think survivors sort of saw as following from the messages they had received. This is how they felt about relationships, what we in psychology call fancily relational images that contributed to a tendency to withdraw rather than reach out. So about half of them described a sense of profound aloneness. One person said, I felt alone, I guess, because I felt like nobody truly knows my story. Many expressed deep distrust of other people, not seeing them as dependable or seeing them as out to take advantage of others' vulnerabilities. One person said, people don't always want to be a good person. They don't always have your best interests in mind. And some wanted to avoid the shame they felt, but if they would look weak to others, even others in their own families. So one person said, I didn't want to involve my family in it because I wanted to portray myself to them as being an independent person. I was embarrassed. I didn't want people to think that I would tolerate that. It's embarrassing because people know me to be a strong person, a smart person, someone that didn't take crap. I didn't want people to look down on me. And I asked at that moment, and that weighed stronger than the desire to get help in an emergency? And she said, at that time, yes. For many of the participants, most of the Black women in the study, the cultural stereotype of the strong Black woman contributed to their own personal desire to appear resilient and independent, and not wanting to burden anyone in their network. You know, they would say, like, that's just not the way I am. Again, there were a few exceptions, but that was the dominant theme. Next slide, please. And then at the individual level, just sort of removed from the relational context, many survivors didn't reach out simply because they just didn't think they mattered, not that they were not important to anyone, including their network members, that they were not seen by anyone, including their network members, and not cherished, with a few exceptions. So next slide, please. So looping back to the top, I think what I've tried to show you is that there was this very powerful set of themes in the interviews that we did, where most survivors described this damaging cycle of intergenerational trauma and early systemic intrusion, followed by negative messages from networks alongside their own limited perspectives on relationships, this relational images, limiting relational images, all leading to and following from a sense of not mattering to anyone. So in the dangerous moment, when survivors were terrified and unable to manage on their own, they had nowhere to turn, or they felt that they had nowhere to turn. And that in turn kind of reinforced this pattern of having no one. So I want to turn now on the next slide to what they wanted. So in the face of all of this, we asked participants, what would you wish for in the dangerous moment? What did you need? I think strikingly, many said they simply didn't know. They said things like, how could I know? In that moment, their heads were spinning. They felt like they were having an out-of-body experience. They couldn't think. And I want to illustrate this with a quote. This is the best thing that comes to my mind. If I'm a baby and I busted my head open and I'm walking around and people are just looking at my head busted open and I'm sitting up there and I'm just walking around with a busted head, I don't realize what's going on because I can't see it. I know that it hurts, but if I never get that care for it, it's like I'm going to die. I don't even know how to go to somebody and say, hey, my head is busted. It's just unaware. It's oblivious. I couldn't tell people that I needed them to care. I just literally did not care about myself. And then I asked, even at that moment of danger, you couldn't see what was happening? Yes, even in that moment. And then at the same time, many also could see very clearly what they needed. And some said, I needed help calming him down. Most, but not every single one of the harming partners were men. Help calming him down, someone to pick me up, someone giving me a safe place to stay for a day or two. And then much more commonly, they talked about psychological respite through someone listening without judgment, someone listening with empathy. More specifically, many described wishing for someone to listen in very specific ways, to reflect back the survivor's experience in a way that would help the survivor understand themselves, to respond what the survivor needed once they could figure that out, but not what the listener needed for them. And survivors described in really glowing terms how transformative it was when a friend or family member listened carefully, stayed with the survivor's perspective, and expressed love and a sense of the survivor's value. And this was by far the most cross-cutting and pervasive theme in these interviews, and a surprising one, that even in the most dangerous moment, even when the survivor's life was in danger, or their children's life was in danger, what they said they needed was for someone simply to listen. I would ask, because I found this really surprising, Even when you were in the bathroom with the door locked and your partner banging on the door, you want a listening ear? Really? Yes, really. I have a quote that I think beautifully illustrates this by a woman who eventually was able to receive emotional support at the emergency moment from her brother. She said, "He gave me the type of help that I needed, just to hear his voice, just to know that somebody still loved me out there." They, meaning the harming partners, they find whatever weaknesses and whatever insecurities you have, and they tear each one of those things apart to a point for somebody like me, who I knew I had good self-esteem, can make you feel like the smallest particle of dirt on the ground. Sometimes just to hear that's not how everybody thinks about you. It's everything in the world. It's an empowerment. It gives you strength to say, it's the first step to say, wait a minute, everything that you're saying to me is wrong. Maybe I should leave. Maybe you're not right. And then I, being kind of like slow on the uptake, said, "You needed this at the moment of greatest danger?" And the person said, "I guess it helps you to stop for a moment, rethink and regroup. You know how when Popeye the Sailor Man is getting weak and he's in a fight and he gets that spinach, then he gets this internal strength? It gives you that mental and emotional strength to reevaluate the situation and sometimes figure out, is this the fight or flight situation? Can I de-escalate? I don't know how to explain it. It can help you get the strength to even call the police or just get out of the situation or call someone else or whatever. It gave me strength. It gave me a serenity, a calmness to at least stop my part in the situation. I was able to calm down, quiet myself, to self-reflect on some stuff. I think that was the starting point of me forming an escape plan." And then just a quick quote from somebody else. "I wasn't asking for money. I wasn't asking for a place to stay. I was really asking for somebody just to hold space for me." And again, what is so crucial is that for many participants, this kind of support was in very short supply or completely unavailable, at least in survivors' perception, without any consistent friends or family to turn to, even when their lives were at stake, is a matter of profound concern. So on that note, I want to turn to recommendations that survivors made for us all. And that's the next slide, please. So the range of recommendations include a deepening of our survivor-defined practices in several key areas. First, survivors told us that they wanted us to work with informal network members to increase their capacity to be able to listen, and to understand survivors' needs and to know how to respond in dangerous moments. This could come in the form of workshops or groups for network members, or opportunities for dialogue between survivors and their network members, like mother and daughter pairs or survivor plus other network member pairs, and sort of coaching sessions. They talked about wanting some sort of a buddy approach where DV programs could help two survivors connect with each other and start to develop mutual trust so that they could be there for each other in moments of crisis. And I want to just call out a few amazing programs that are doing things like this. One is the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective with disability activist Mia Mingus, who does pod mapping. In their model, a pod is a set of people you can turn to for support in the face of violent, harmful, or abusive experiences, whether as survivors, bystanders, or people who have harmed. And Mingus has a pod mapping worksheet so that survivors can think in advance about who should be in their pod and who they can trust in moments of danger. Another amazing initiative that overlaps with this particular recommendation is the CHAT project, which stands for the Collective Healing and Transformation Project, also in Northern California. This is a restorative justice project that resides in the community and helps survivors, community allies, and sometimes the person who caused the harm to come together in circles for safe and meaningful face-to-face dialogue. And then for advocates themselves, the call from survivors was to do more deep listening, and to do that even when the urge for the advocate to act rather than listen is strong. And I know that my friends from Safe Horizon are going to say a lot more about that. So in sum, what do survivors wish for? They want an opportunity to slow down, think with someone, even in dangerous moments. And they want those someones to be a friend or family member who gets it, or an advocate that they can turn to easily to listen. I know that the listening ear is something that is not as simple as it sounds. And for that, I'm going to turn to the wisdom of Kelly and Lisa, specifically on how to do this work, taking an anti-racist approach. So turning it over to you all.
Thank you, Lisa. Thanks for all that information and so much of raising up the lessons from survivors directly and from hearing their voices. We wanted this webinar to really be driven by survivor realities, and there's so many things that we could talk about. But we wanted to take up the issues that they raise. So we're going to focus on two things. First, listening without judgment, and then also the community as a resource for survivors. And Kelly, would you just start us off by giving us a sense of Safe Horizons' approach to client-centered advocacy with this anti-oppression lens?
Yeah, thanks so much. And thank you for that, Lisa Goodman. I always love hearing about your research. So I just thought I'd start by giving you just a couple sentences about Safe Horizon to sort of ground you in where this practice is coming from. That Safe Horizon, we're about almost 45 years old. And we started out as a small pilot program working in courts, and over the years have grown into a large human services nonprofit who serves about 250,000 New Yorkers every year, specifically New Yorkers who've been impacted by crime, violence, and abuse. And we work throughout all 5 boroughs of the city. So we provide healing and support for people who've experienced a wide range of things, including interpersonal violence, community violence, structural violence, which includes child abuse, sexual assault, trafficking, stalking, youth homelessness, intimate partner violence, and crimes like robbery and assault. And I just think it's important to give you that context because we work with a wide diversity of folks across New York City, including across age range, race, gender, sexual orientation, culture, and religion, both in the clients that we serve and in the almost 1,000 staff that work with us. And so why do I bring that into the discussion? I think it's because we understand how complex and how unique all the circumstances that bring people to Safe Horizon and how unique their choices are to what they think is going to be most helpful to keep them safe. And so our approach has been really developed over the last 45 years based on our experience with our clients and from the advocates who help us lead the way. So to answer your question, Jill.
Can you slow down a little bit?
Oh, yeah, sorry. My New York talking is coming out. I forget I'm from North Carolina. I've got to bring back my slow Southern speech. I'm doing my Manhattan talk. So let me tell you a little bit about client-centered practice or how we listen to clients at Safe Horizon. We have a practice approach that we refer to as client-centered practice, or CCP. And what we really think about that is it is a way that we work with clients. And I think the key pillars are they help us to demonstrate respect for the client, this non-judgment thing that we've been talking about, as well as compassion and empathy. It represents a shift. I've been doing domestic violence work, 20, 25 years now. And I can remember when I started and being a young advocate, and if I didn't give a client something, I didn't feel like I had done anything for them. And so our shift is really moving away from service provision to helping ourselves and our advocates really see how the client, the survivor, is really the expert in their own safety. And that we really need to slow down and listen to them. And so it's grounded both in research that we've done, as well as the practice wisdom from our advocates. So these key pillars, we'll talk a little bit about them. One, it's respect. And what does that mean? Not just respect for the human that's sitting across for us in the interaction, which is important, but also respect for the complex choices that they've had to make in order to get there to talk to us, right? Trying to respect their lived experiences, the choices, understanding that there's no right way to be a survivor, right? That many of us have to make a lot of decisions and a lot of choices in order to survive, and that the pathway to healing looks different for everyone and the pathway to safety. The thing when I'm meeting with I had new hire orientation with some staff today, and I think this sentence is something that means the most to me, is that we believe the clients and believe that they're accurate in their reporting of their risks and of the things that they think will keep them safe. And I guess I want to really lean into that in my experience, many of us say that we believe that clients are the experts in their own lives until our clients start making decisions that we disagree with, or until we get really worried and scared for our safety. And then we suddenly start centering ourselves again and think we know best. Another pillar of really listening without judgment is that compassion that we heard survivors talking about, and just understanding that trauma and violence and crime and systematic oppression has an impact on our client. And so we aim to make sure that in our interactions with us, that we're not re-traumatizing a person when they're reaching out to seek help. And then the thing that makes the most sense and is the most obvious, and definitely one of the hardest, is this non-judgment. We'll spend a little bit more time talking about that, but it means non-judgment about experiences that they have had, choices that they made to get safe, things that they're prioritizing about their safety. We might be feeling totally worried and totally freaked out about this particular part of their experience. And the survivor's like, yep, but here's what I'm prioritizing, and sort of having to sort of level and pause our judgment right there. And then I'd say the last pillar of listening without judgment is informed decisions, that we think it's our job to listen to the client and then tell them what they want to know based on what they're asking us. So here's what we know about this particular system. Here are some of the pros and cons of this. Do you want to move forward? What else would you like to know? And so I guess that's how I might start answering that question, Jill, is like, I think that those things feel key to really getting into an engagement with clients, is sort of centering, coming in, trying to build trust and respect before we start diving into like, here's what you can and should do.
Sure, thanks. Lisa, did you want to add anything at this point?
I would just offer that a part of that conversation really centers around the risks that survivors are centering. And so for so many advocates, we're so worried about the violence that they may be experiencing, but survivors are bringing to us, there are life-generated risks like poverty, there are circumstances like racism. There's a lot of different things that might be posing a risk to the clients that we're serving. So if we're only focused on abuse, that we're not really being client-centered, because the client might be most worried about this other thing that has nothing to do with the specific violence that they're experiencing today. So it really does push you to open and be able to hear more in this client-centered way.
It's so hard when the priority risk is not the violence, the intimate partner violence. And that so frequently happens for BIPOC survivors, because they're dealing with so many other things. It so resonated, Kelly, when you said, when you started out, and I hear this all the time, it's like, all I did was listen. We hear advocates say that all I did was listen. And we hear from Lisa's research, that important research, and that important message is all folks wanted was for us to listen. And so I think some of it is us learning how to value that essential role that we're playing. Would you mind just talking a little bit about how you're supporting advocates in this day to day? I mean, as you said, it's difficult, it's challenging day in and day out. How are you doing that?
Yeah, there's a couple of things that we do at Safe Horizon that I think are really key. One, supervision. That we try, I meet with my team weekly for at least an hour, closed door, like what's on your mind? What are you most worried about? But there's a lot, you could unpack the word supervision for days, right? There's a lot of problematic connotations with that word. But what I try to do is enter into a right relationship with my team, right? Where you're centering authenticity, showing up with your full self, right? And I think it's important to model that in our interactions so that we can model that with clients. So making it okay for people to be parents at work, to make it okay to be a woman of color at work, to make it okay to learn, to make it okay to make mistakes, to cry, to be happy, to be mad. Because I think so often, as people of color in particular, like we're taught that advocacy and safety looks a particular way, that like, Lisa and I sort of joke when we meet with new Safe Horizon employees, they're always like, hi, and what brought you in today? And I'm like, let's all we've all know what we think an advocate's supposed to look like. Like, how do you say that, right? What makes the most sense for you? And how do we talk to people? For myself, I can remember being taught that you don't bring you into the interactions, right? You try to bring this like neutral, fake person into the conversation. And I think we're reteaching that and telling people you can bring your racialized self into the conversation. And if there's sameness, you can say, like, I've had experiences like that too. Let's talk about that. And where there's not, you can say, I don't understand this lived experience, but I know it might be a thing. So I heard you say you were worried about going to the police. Tell me what your experience has been like. And then let's see if we can partner together on a way to help you feel safer. So I think part of that is just bringing real conversations into peer groups, into supervision, into client interactions. We also listen to clients. We also check in with clients. You get it wrong. You know when you're talking to a client and you have like gone down the wrong path, right? And we really talk with our staff about how to say, hold on, it seems like we've gotten off track. Like what, I've said something that hasn't worked. So tell me what's happened and let's try to get back on. Because one of the things that we notice is when we're not listening to clients, we develop beautiful safety plans that have absolutely nothing to do with their real life, right? Like it looks great. It's sort of like if you make a budget for yourself and absolutely don't follow it. On paper, you have savings. In practice, it's not working out, right? And so we try to like help advocates know it's okay to talk about the real deal with clients and to say like, it's okay to be worried about that. And it just, to give it a really practical example, when I first started at Safe Horizon about 10 years ago, I had a client that I was working with who was the perfect candidate for a protective order, like partner scared of being arrested and didn't want to be, check. Had things that people could see that had happened to her on her body, check. Had witnessed, like just everything was right about it. And so I talked to her about a protective order and how it could be useful. She said, yes, that sounds great. I talked to her about our court advocates. I said, do you want to go and see that? She said, yes, that was great. We made an appointment. She didn't show up. So the next day we like role played. I'm like, oh, it's probably the court. She's very nervous about court. So we role played how you get in, didn't show up. So finally, in talking with my supervisor, I'm like, I'm not sure what I'm missing. And she said, well, why don't you ask? Turns out. And so I said, like, we had this good plan. You haven't shown up, so I'm guessing something else is more important. So can we talk about that? And she was finally able to say that her partner's sister was the only family that she has, that she had been in foster care and sort of got involved with this man when she was like 16. And this sister was important to her. And if she got him involved in the criminal justice system, she was going to lose that relationship. And for this client, she was her safety around having family and having this woman in her life was the thing that she was prioritizing over the DV, which is what was most on my mind. And I think being able to like hear that conversation and be able to then safety plan with her around this relationship helped her open up other strategies that could actually help keep her safe from the domestic violence. And so it's being able to like stop and say like, I'm missing something. Help me know what that might be. Lisa, what would you add?
I would just offer that in addition to kind of what Kelly has described, there's also the work that has to happen with the advocates directly. So many of the advocates that work at Safe Horizon are Black and Brown people themselves. And so they are working and navigating the world with all of its micro and macro aggressions as Black and Brown people. And so they are also, many of the survivors that we're seeing are also Black and Brown people. So there's a conversation to be had in this space that Kelly is describing, that supervision becomes sacred, right? So much of what could happen when I'm a Black woman sitting across from a Black person, I may be assuming some sameness that actually isn't there. And so I'm planning based on what I would do as a Black person, and this other person is looking at me like, yeah, that's not what I want to do. And so really being able to create that space where advocates themselves reflect on their own racialized selves and how they're showing up in partnership. And also that they're dealing with some of the same issues of race that our clients are. And so where do they get space to talk about that? So supervision is not just a place to talk about case practice, but it really is a space for advocates to reflect on issues of race. And that can be really transformative. Like, where do you talk about race in the workplace, right? And I also think it's about creating affinity spaces that are aligned by some kind of shared identity, which includes race, so that there can be another layer of support. So much of what our advocates have access to is not only their supervisors and their colleagues, but they also are in affinity group spaces that staff have self-defined, that we need to be able to come here and talk about how big and crazy the world is, and what I might be experiencing as a Black person coming to work every day, listening to the pain of other Black and Brown people. So really creating those spaces continues to bolster our advocates to be able to do this kind of client-centered work.
Would you just talk a little bit about supporting advocates, and particularly advocates of color, as they're working in systems where there's this expectation of them, the expectation of the survivor, and also this expectation that our job as advocates is to get folks to leave, to get them, for example, Kelly, like you said, to file for the protective order, those kinds of things. What are the conversations in supervision and elsewhere that you're helping advocates deal with that?
Yeah, we think it starts even before the hire, right? So we're talking with folks in interviews about the various spaces. So we have staff that work in every single New York City precinct, for example, working to support folks who have filed police reports in the city. And so we spend time talking to advocates about the environment that they're going to be working in, and does that work for them? Like, first, let's talk about that. We spend a lot of time talking with one another about what it feels like, especially to be a person of color in a system who becomes a gatekeeper. And that can feel really hard to be asked to hold up or enforce things that we know to be either systemically oppressive or outright racist, right? And there has an impact on us. So we've made it okay to engage in those conversations. We spend a lot of time talking with our partners about what those things feel like and look like, to try to make an impact sort of from within the system, and trying to sort of talk about what's realistic to expect of our staff and of clients and what's not. But I don't know, Lisa, do we spend any hour at Safe Horizon not talking about this? That I think it's just something that we don't pretend like isn't there, and offer as much support as we can in planning around what those experiences can be like. I think what Lisa just raised around our affinity spaces are really important. And we try to make it okay for, there are going to be things that, just by sort of what Lisa was saying, just because I'm a person of color, I don't have every person of color's experience, right? As a matter of fact, I'm fairly light-skinned. I have a lot of passing privilege, so I'm definitely not going to have the experience of all people of color. And so trying to make space where it's okay for people to point out blind spots or just outright things that you miss. And so how do we create environments where we don't have to harm our staff or our clients to learn things? So we put a lot of emphasis on ourselves to learn and grow. We try to be in relationship with people, so when there's those oops, ouch moments, we can solve from those, even through, we have a racial response healing team. I just said all of those words in the right order, you can make that work. So that when we know those things happen, both at work or with partners, we have opportunities to, for folks to say that this is something that happens that I want to talk about. And so I think there's no one right thing. It's looking at all of the ways that are, from practice models to role playing to supervision to affinity groups to policies to interviewing, that it's how do you make it just a part of the fabric of the work that you're doing. And so I can tell you a huge mistake I made that I think is just indicative of the environment that we're in. That when I first moved up, I moved up from very rural Western North Carolina to Brooklyn. That was quite the change. And when I first started working at one of our shelters, which were confidential locations, we had law enforcement that stopped by that wanted our cameras had caught a crime that had happened in the community, and they stopped by to ask for it. And our policy at the time still is that, nobody comes into the shelter, period. And I wasn't on site. I was the director at the time. And one of my staff, of course, they came in, brought police right in, gave them a copy of the video. And I come in the next day and I'm like, what happened? Here's our policy. Were you unclear? Should we role play? I did all sorts of things with that. And so finally, this was an employee I had a lot of respect for, but just could not understand what happened. And it happened a couple of times that week as they were really trying to get a little bit more footage. And finally, she was able to say to me, you can tell that person no, I can't. This is my, like, I live here. I don't leave this neighborhood every day, and this could cause problems for me in the rest of my life. And that's not different than what we have to hear from our clients, that like, so my solution was to help do training with her, and what she needed is something that we now have in place, where we have sort of like, here's our general counsel's number. If you need this, this is what you do. It wasn't training she needed. I was completely missing the racialized context to what was happening for her. Anyway, so we try to make things like that, things that we can talk about and notice. Lisa, what would you?
Yeah, I think the issues about kind of being a part of systems is always a tricky place for Safe Horizon to exist. And one of the things that we know is that what we want for survivors is a range of options, right? It's not this or that. It's what do I need in the moment? Lisa, I loved hearing the different quotes that you use, because people want different things at different points in their lives. And our role is to not say, no, not this system or that system until the system changes, because system change takes time and I need help today. And so really engaging in conversations about what are all the things that you're interested in doing as a survivor that we can access for you. So our staff spend a lot of time in systems, and part of their work is they're actually a little bit of a go-between, right? That you need something from the court, our staff can help you navigate that, so that you are not necessarily bearing the brunt of all of what is going to be hard, what is going to be harsh, what is going to be discriminatory. Like, we can play a little bit of a buffer in those spaces. And so I do think there is value to being able to do that work with survivors. And then there are times that you're in the community and there's no system that is around and available, and yet you're doing community work to support survivors. And then there's everything in between. And so I think when we're talking about kind of working with systems, it's acknowledging that until we have something else, there needs to be some responsiveness, because it's what we have. And so creating all of those options for survivors is really important. Like, to Kelly's point, someone may not really be interested in that order of protection, but there are people for whom it is important. And so we don't want to shut that off because we have thoughts and feelings about the systems that we're a part of. Right, that's the listening. And, I think that's the hardest part when client-centered practice comes into place. It's when someone is saying something and you're like, oh, but if that were me, I would. It's like, well, that's not you. And you don't know what sacrifices someone is willing to make for their safety. They do. And so sit back, listen in, and just kind of hold on for the ride, because so much of what we do comes from fear. Right? So much of what we do, we're worried about parents, we're worried about their children. And so we want to wrap them up in all of this bubble wrap that includes orders of protection and police and community and housing and, job. We want to wrap them in those things. And that's not often something that we can do all the time, but we can listen, we can understand, and we can behave from that place, even within systems.
Lisa, what you reminded me of is when we talk to even, especially newer advocates, but even folks that have been with us for a while, people will say, so I don't get to know anything? Like, I'm an expert, so if I'm only listening, I don't get to know anything? And so, like, when do I get to tell the survivor what I know? And it's not listen, period, end of sentence. It's listening and asking questions and being curious and helping the survivor to tell you the thing that they're most worried about and the thing that they're going to think is going to keep them the most safe. And then that's where our expertise comes in to say, okay, so you're interested in this from your experience. This is the thing that's going to make you most safe. Let me tell you what I know about how that particular resource works, and let's learn about the rest of these things together. So I think that's the thing that is hard for folks, is they're like, I've got a lot of experience. I know lots of things, but if I'm listening, when do I get to do my job? And it's listening to make sure you're clear on what it is that we're supposed to be telling, what they need our help understanding.
I always say to staff that I used to do new hire orientation that Kelly described, that listening is such a gift, right? There's so much that we have to do when we're working within systems, when we're working with other things. And it almost feels like we're moving mountains sometimes to connect clients to resources. And when you're listening, you can really hear what our clients want and what they need. And that's such a powerful part of the relationship. because you might be the first person that someone has told this to. You're probably the first person that might have believed this person. I'm listening to, Lisa's research where people were like, I wasn't believed. Our jobs as advocates is to listen so that you hear that we believe you. We don't need any proof. We don't need to see pictures. We don't need to see bruises. We don't need to see any of that. We can take your words and we can go from there. And that's what's most helpful to responding to you, right? It's not all the other, I have expertise in these, because sometimes, much to people's chagrin when they first start doing this work, is someone can leave an interaction with not one single referral, not one single connection, but I listen and I understand what might be some options to me, and I know that I can come back, right? So when I'm ready to make a different decision, maybe a month from now or tomorrow, I can come back because this person listened to me, heard me, and didn't try to make me do something that I wasn't ready for or willing to do at the time, because you don't know me. You don't know what resources are available to me. You don't know that I'm not willing to sacrifice my relationship with the person who's causing me harm's sister. Like, you don't know that unless you listen to me, unless we have these conversations. So I often think about listening as such a gift. And I think it's so important to the work that we do. And I can't emphasize it enough in how you do this work.
So one of the lessons there's many lessons, but one from survivors is that listening is what we need to do. Thank you for helping us understand more about how to do it and how to support advocates to do it. I want to go on to our next topic, but before I do that, I just want to make sure there wasn't something else you wanted to tell us about listening without judgment. Or Lisa Goodman, is there anything you wanted to sort of connect us with back to the research that we haven't done?
No, I am just appreciating these subtleties that you raise so much. I think that, obviously I couldn't present all of the richness of what was said in these interviews, but the example you gave about the person who harmed sister, Lisa, that is not atypical. It is very complicated in ways that advocates can't possibly understand why one would not want to call the police on a person who harmed, or let anyone know, or, and in fact, be fearful of sharing this information with a friend or family member because of what they might do to the person who harms. So and one can only know that through listening, and then listening a little bit more. So I very much appreciate that. And then Kelly's example of listening, not only to survivors, but as supervisors and programs, listening to advocates, is a layer that I don't get, I don't hear much. And I have done many, many focus groups with advocates in your organization, and am struck by what I think is the outcome of your encouragement of truth-telling, which is a lot of truth-telling, no hesitation about talking about how Safe Horizon could improve, what it does well. And there's just like a freedom and authenticity among your advocates that I think emerges from this, the sort of senior level staff truly listening. So that's all I have to say.
Jill, before we go on, it's just something that just occurred to me. I realized that we addressed advocates who are themselves Black and Brown folks, but I also want to just put a note in for white advocates, right? That you're not absolved of your responsibilities in these conversations as well. So for white advocates, it really means for us that you have also sacred supervision space that includes all of the reflection and all of those things, but it's also a place for white advocates to reflect on their own power and privilege in relationships, where white people can call each other in about bias and white fragility. So it's even more important for those spaces to also do some good work, because it's not just the responsibility of Black and Brown people to take care of other Black and Brown people, right? But really that white advocates, you also have a very specific role and a very specific calling when it comes to naming issues of race and kind of your own whiteness in these relationships. So I just wanted to kind of not leave out our advocates who are white folks who are doing this work as well.
Thank you. For us, in relation with other advocates, but also as we're trying to listen without judgment, there's so many things that get in the way that we have to be aware of and be able to talk about freely and own. So thank you for raising that. Absolutely. Okay, so let's move on to the second topic that we wanted to explore. we wanted to talk about the community as a resource for survivors. And we hear the word community thrown around a lot. So I think it would just really be helpful if we could start by, if you would just talk a little bit about what we mean by community.
Yeah. First and foremost, I'll offer that community for the survivor needs to be defined by the survivor. And I think, Lisa, your research talked about that in some really important ways. So who is in folks' community is survivor defined, right? Like when I think about work that I have done in the past in some restorative places that I've done, groups of people really play different roles in people's lives. So when you talked about like the pod mapping, Lisa, that resonated really strongly with me because there are people who may identify different people in their lives who play very specific roles, and they don't want those roles to intertwine at all. So there might be that person in my community that they have a place for me and my kids to stay if I needed it. There's a place that I can get food if for whatever reason that's a need. There's someone who might accompany me to court if I need them to go with me to some big scary place. There's someone who can watch my kids or that I can borrow a few bucks from when I'm in a tight spot. And these can be different people at different times. And so it really is helping people see who is in their community. So that's something that we actually talk about with clients, is asking them, well, is there anyone that you're getting support from? And then we want to know what kind of support is it? And is that support helpful? Because I also think that people have people in their lives who may be consistent, but if they really spent time thinking about it, they're not as helpful as they want them to be. And I think that that's just information that people can then utilize in how they navigate their world. I think a survivor's community can be this really beautiful quilt of different pieces and people who have a very specific placement in my safety journey. And so for some survivors, advocates can be a part of that community. And our role as advocates is to help you think about those resources. And there are times that we've kind of talked with people about, well, who knows about this? And what do they know? And that might be that different people know different pieces of your story. And that's also something to help bolster people in thinking about who are the people in their life that can be helpful. One of the things when I used to work with young people who were experiencing different types of violence, something that always came to the forefront is that they had fractured relationships with families, either because of isolation, where the person who's causing them harm has intentionally kind of isolated them, and others it's because the family or the friends didn't want to deal with the violence. Like, I don't want to deal with that part of your life. And so their relationships are ruptured. And when you think about your 20, 21, 22, you're navigating the world in this really interesting place where you think you know a lot, but you don't know as much. You need some support, but you don't have people who can help you. So really thinking with young people about, are those relationships that you want to revisit? Because that might be something that might not have been on the plate, a couple of years ago, but is it on the plate now? And it's something that you can continue to explore. It doesn't have to be all or never. And I think that's the beautiful thing about the community, that the community can continue to shift and change as you need it to and as dictated by you, because you are the center of this kind of, I'm going to use the word the pod map, because you are the center of that pod. You get to decide who's in it and how long they stay.
Kelly, did you want to add to that?
I think it's something we'll get to, but one thing, Lisa, when she was talking about the fractured relationships, I think that's something that we haven't done enough with in our movement is thought about how we can help if we know a basic tenet is we know domestic violence in general, and systems destroy families. How can we help repair relationships where safe people exist? And I think that's something for us to continue to explore and develop our expertise around sort of healing broken relationships, whether it's with whoever is in that pod or who people wish could still be in that pod.
So do you want to talk a little bit about when you've seen and how you support advocates in identifying the community, and then when it's going to be helpful, but also when the community, and I think, Lisa, you started to talk about this, but when the community might actually be a risk, when it might make things worse or more difficult, and how we as advocates might engage with individual survivors around addressing those issues.
I think that community response can be helpful to survivors when there's clarity about what is better for the survivor and their children when it's defined by the survivor. So like I was even watching some things in the chat, there's so many people that want you to leave this relationship. They want you to do this other thing. And so their support of you is contingent upon those things. And so that's actually not helpful. We all need to have clarity about what do I want for me and my kids? And therefore, how do I get the support to kind of wrap around me to do that? And so lives can be much better organized and safer when that clarity exists about the role of people in the community. So for example, something that Safe Horizon has been spending a lot of time with is that there are a lot of different people who are developing apps and devices that allow people to contact others rather than law enforcement in the moment of danger. And people bring those things for us to look at, and we spend time giving them feedback as kind of experts in this field, like what would they all need to think about. And so the idea about these devices or the app is that a survivor has access to this. And when something happens, they can activate the app or the device, and an alert goes out to a predetermined list of people. That can work if everyone on that list has had a real conversation with the survivor about what would be helpful when you get that alert, right? There might be that person who is a friend that I want you to come wherever I am because the person who's causing me harm won't make a scene in front of you, or whatever the dynamics are, the violence can end because just you're there. Person B might be, they know to call others and make sure that my kids are someplace safe. So their role in my life is about kid safety. There might be others, if that person shows up, it's actually going to make it worse. So please don't show up. But person C might be the person on the list that is getting a room ready for me, or, making up the sofa so that when I need a safe place tonight, it's available without thinking. So it's the real conversations about when you get this alert, do this, but definitely don't do that, right? I think it's dangerous when it's not rooted in that, because survivors sometimes want people to do different things in their lives. And like when I heard you, Lisa, say that, they might want someone to call the police, but they don't want to do it themselves. That's clarity about your role. But if I don't want police to show up, and that's your go-to response as a person on my list, you potentially caused more harm to me. And so really having some real conversations about when that alarm goes off on your phone, this is what I want you to do. And so our questions when we're talking to survivors is really understanding who is that web? Who are the people that know? What do they know? What should they know? Are there other people you want to know who don't know? And can there be ways that we talk with you about what that could look like? So it's really helping people have real conversations about who is your community and what do you need them for. And it's so important to keep asking, right? People's lives shift and change. And so today it might have been a good option for so-and-so to be in my community, tomorrow not so much. And I think the other thing about when we talk about community and safety for our survivors, so many survivors' communities have also caused them harm, whether it be through culture or religion or whatever other belief systems, that communities have caused our survivors harm. So it can't be assumed that because you belong to this group that they are going to be helpful to you. So that's why, talking about, are those resources actually really helpful to you? And so I think it really depends on that kind of conversation that you're consistently asking. You're asking about what are all the risks that are associated with that, and therefore we can think about what are community generated supports that might be available to you to respond to that. And it might be your immediate pod, or it might be other things literally within your neighborhood that might be a resource. And so that's some of the work that we do, is also trying to understand, big C community versus little c community.
Kelly, did you want to add to that? I'm not saying you could, I'm just asking. That was a great answer. Thank you, Lisa. Terrific. So let's talk a little bit more about, it just sounds like, I'm hearing advocates in my head saying, like, this sounds like it takes a lot of time. This doesn't feel like 15 minutes in the courthouse when really I need to know up or down, protective order or not. So how are you just sort of building in that space? How are you talking about that? How are you, operationalizing, trying to institutionalize this client-centered practice?
So I will offer that, interactions with clients can be anywhere from 15 minutes and you have a really good client-centered practice, which kind of hits all the things, to an hour. It doesn't all have to be very formulaic, right? Your goal is to get a certain kind of information where you're trying to understand risks for people. And then you're also then trying to understand what are the ways that we can help you manage your risk. And so those two things are kind of prime and partial to every single conversation. What are the risks? What are the ways that we can help manage you that? And in the what are the ways that we can help you manage that, that's the conversation in our community, right? It sounds like it can be very arduous, like we have to have these ongoing relationships, and we don't. In truth, there's so many of the clients that come to Safe Horizon that we see one time. And our goal in that one time is if we're only going to get you for one time, there's a lot that we need to get done, but it can be done in a very organized conversation where you're really just listening to someone, understanding what they're needing, and really trying to gauge how do we manage the risk that you're prioritizing. Because there might be a lot of risk, but the person is saying, I only have these two things that I want to prioritize. And then we're focusing on those two things. So it's really guided by the survivor and what is it that they want to share with you and what kind of help they're seeking from you. And so you don't have to do all of it all of the time. It really is it's a roadmap to getting to a destination of supporting a client, but there are lots of detours that can happen, or it can literally be the straight line. And I think that's the beauty of the flexibility of kind of doing client-centered work, is that it isn't this kind of cookie cutter approach. It really is, where is the survivor looking to drive today, and how do we navigate along with them?
So we're starting to come to the end of our time. So I wanted to just invite all of you, Lisa O'Connor, Lisa Goodman, and Kelly, just to talk about ways and ideas about how advocates either in individual work could support the community and that network, the social network of survivors. So if she says, yeah, I get that, but would you talk to my mother? Would you explain that? Because she needs, she had her own history, she has her own stuff, and I need you to tell her that I am not supposed to be told to leave or do whatever, for example, or on a larger scale, the big C, little c community work that you talked about, Lisa. So I just invited anybody want to start and jump in.
I think that's a big question.
I apologize for that.
No, that's okay. I think as advocates, part of one of the things that Safe Horizon spends time thinking about, but also given our size makes it something that we continually work at, is being a part of the community. Right. So when you're in a community and you know what's available, it's also knowing what's your lane and what are other people's lanes so that you can connect people, right? So you may not be the advocate who can talk to somebody's mama about what's going on in their lives, but you might know of someone who's willing to do kind of, repair work or doing some kind of restorative work with family. So it's knowing who else is in your own community as an advocate, because you can't do all of it. That's not what we're asking advocates to do, is to be everything, but to know where to go and have your own network of relationships feels really important in how you're supporting survivors. Survivors typically live in neighborhoods that either are resource rich or resource not. And so really knowing what are the resources that are available makes a difference. And if you don't know, knowing where to find out. Right? None of us is doing this work by ourselves, right? And we can't do this work by ourselves. So I think that's a really important piece for advocates to be in. And I think also uplifting community response. So much of what we talk about, is about service, and the service that you get is what door you enter through. So if you entered this door, this is the service you're going to get. And so really stepping away from that, the community doesn't always have that one singular service, but really understanding what are all of the things that could be available and uplifting that as a part of the conversation, right? I don't think we talk enough about what communities can do to support survivors. So much of what we talk about is doing away with systems and having a community response, but we haven't said, what is that community response? And it's part of the community being together to say, these are all the things that we as a community can do, and that we all know what's in that cipher so that we can take advantage of that as a collective, because no one provider, no one agency, no one organization is going to be able to do all of it.
Jill, I also think if you go down to the individual community, also thinking about, I'm just not sure that we ask enough about what happened with the relationship with your whomever that might be, like family of origin, the people that raised you, and I'm Lisa and I were talking, I guess, in the recent past, but like in one of our programs, like the average age of our clients is like 20, so like it could just be that there was a really terrible thing that happened when someone was 16 or 17 and just don't know that yet that repairs can be made. Now, it's possible that there may be unsafe family that we can't go back to, but also sometimes it could be my person said, if you go back to them, I'll never talk to you again. And because I was 17, I just believed that to be true. And so I've started engaging lightly in conversations with some programs that I work with to say, like, have we explored their relationships and their friends and like offered any support in any of that? And it, I feel like there's a lot of opportunity there, because I know I'm not the only one on this call. It takes a whole network of people to make me successful, like from the person who's picking up my kid today to like all of those things that are happening. And so I feel like helping survivors build and rebuild networks to help hold them up will help survivors not need systems, whatever those systems might be, so much if they can get back to their community systems.
I just want to piggyback on that, Kelly, to draw us back to the research findings and just to sort of call out as loudly as I can what survivors said to us over and over and over again, which is, please talk to my mother, my sister, my family, talk to them, because I don't know how to get them to give me what I need. So just to piggyback on what you said, Kelly, and to say that I've also talked to so many survivors in your programs and others who say, I just want my blank, but my blank doesn't know how to be there for me. So to your point, I think that's just a place where I see that our programs don't do very much, and it's just a huge arena that survivors are asking us to enter.
So it looks like we're getting really close to the end now. I just wanted to invite any of the panelists to last words. I want to thank you for the incredible conversation and for raising up so clearly survivors' voices in research and in practice, and also how you're supporting advocates' work, which are so essential. So I think I'll turn it back to, I think it's Heidi, but thank you all. And thanks to everyone who's attended.
Thanks, Jill. And thank you so much to all of you. This was extraordinary. We do have like a couple of questions. I don't think we're going to be able to get through every single one of them, but I'm going to turn it over to Brittany or Marlena to go through these questions for you all. Okay.
Great. Thank you, Heidi. So we do have a couple of questions, and I am going to pick out one that I see right now. One of them says, sharing the same story can be exhausting. Is there a thing that can help survivors so that, is there a way for survivors or advocates to actually think about how to help survivors so that they don't need to continuously explain?
Yeah, maybe I'll start and Lisa, see what you have to say. I think a quick answer is different than how it was trained 20-something years ago. At Safe Horizon, we don't need to hear the history of what's happened. So, Jill, to your comment, somebody comes into the courts, they're like, I need a protective order. We don't go back to tell me about 10 years ago. We're like, why do you feel like you need a protective order right now? What's happened in the last today, tonight, tomorrow that's got you worried about that? And we really work from right there to get folks from where I think there's this habit of feeling like we need to get 20 years of history. And there could be times when that's important or that might be relevant, but many times I embarrassed myself one time at Safe Horizon meeting with some of our electeds around flexible financial dollars for clients. And I said, stop sending people to budgeting class. Sometimes they just need pants, like right? And I think, and I was like, oh my God, I literally just said, sometimes people need pants. That's my quote. But I think that's relevant in the answer to this question is like, hear what they're asking, ask what's behind that request, and then move from there. We don't need to know everything necessarily that led them up. So that's sort of in a short amount of time. Lisa O'Connor, I don't know if you would add what you would add to that.
I think that's exactly right. Survivors get to choose what they share with us and how much of that. And for us, it's really getting to, you had a choice and you made the choice today to do this thing where you reached out to us, what drove that choice? And so it really is focused on the here and now. What are you most worried about? And so you get to decide what you share about what you're most worried about, as opposed to, like, as Kelly described, what was the worst event? What happened 10 years ago? We don't need to hear all that in that first moment. It might be relevant later, but at the beginning, it's just, what are you worried about today that made you pick up the phone, walk into this building, call this other program? What made you make that choice today?
I think the one thing I wish I would have added in the beginning, but I'll do it now, is also we've trained survivors and people of color and people of low socioeconomic status that they must prove to us that they're worth our time. And so I try sometimes when folks to come in to just say, you don't need to bear it all unless that's important to you. That I think there's a way that we have trained folks to have to come in and rip all their Band-Aids off and just completely expose themselves to us in order to be worthy of our help. And so I try to front load that, and they're like, hey, let's talk about what we can do here. Here's our confidentiality. And you do not owe me any part besides what you want to share. And I think front loading that for folks so they don't feel like they have to in order to be considered worthy enough is important.
I feel like it's 3:29, so I think we've reached the end of our panel discussion. So thank you all. And now just hit it back to Heidi.
Thank you all so much again for joining us. And as we said earlier, this is also part of our work to center the lived experiences of survivors from BIPOC communities and advocates. So much gratitude for all of your wisdom, for your concrete strategies to support survivors and advocates in the work. And we already received a request for a part 2. So hopefully we'll be in touch soon and perhaps organize these conversations amongst many of us as we continue sharing the knowledge and our experiences in our work. Have a wonderful rest of the day, and we'll be in touch soon. Thanks again.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.